Hello, just want to welcome everyone as you file in, letting you know that you're in the right place. We're going to get things started in about another minute, but we thank you for joining us. Again, I want to welcome all of you to today's Safety and Health webcast sponsored by JJ Keller. Going to allow another 30 seconds or so for everyone to get filed in. Okay, an official hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. OSHA 101, Expertise Requires Mastering the Basics, sponsored by JJ Keller. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health magazine and will be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. In a few minutes, we'll start a presentation, but first let's review some preliminary items. The views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and may not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not necessarily mean the council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we'll conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we might not get to every question. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded along to today's speakers. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and we'll let you know more about that after the presentation. This webcast will be archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Our speakers today are Rachel Krupsak and Brandon Black, who both serve JJ Keller in the role of editor EHS. Rachel answers compliance questions from EHS professionals, edits two manuals, and creates content for online solutions, webcasts, training materials, and handbooks. Her topics of expertise include hazard communication, OSHA training requirements, and hearing conservation. Brandon joined JJ Keller in 2025. Prior to that, he spent more than 10 years in EHS roles in the manufacturing and warehousing sectors. His interests include powered industrial trucks, fall protection, hazard communication, and machine guarding. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. Rachel, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Kevin, and thanks you everyone for joining us today. We're glad that you're here and could join us. So finally, a safety solution that works as hard as you do. The Safety Management Suite streamlines compliance at every level of your business, making it easy to develop, implement, and maintain an industry-specific safety program. And because your success is our priority, today's attendees will be offered complimentary access to our compliance tools and resources in the Safety Management Suite. On behalf of our sponsor, JJ Keller Safety Management Suite, thank you for joining us. So I saw a quotation once saying that expertise is just mastery of the basics. Maybe that's not true for every situation, but you can't become an expert without first building a solid foundation of the basics. Today, we are going to cover a number of areas at a high level. After all, if you don't know where to begin looking for problems that need solving, then you're certainly not going to solve them. These topics are based on common areas of confusion that we've seen over many years. For example, knowing the differences between federal OSHA and state OSHA plans can be critical to staying in compliance. Knowing the top OSHA violations can help you focus your compliance efforts. And if an OSHA inspector knocks on your door, you'd better be prepared, and that requires some planning. For specific topics, we'll give an overview of the injury record keeping requirements. We get more questions on this than anything else. And our second most common topic for customer questions involving training requirements, so we will also go over that a bit. Many OSHA standards also require a written plan, but we're betting you'll find a few surprises in this area. Finally, we'll give you some best practices on conducting self-inspections to help you stay in compliance and keep your employees safe. So you all know that OSHA is a federal agency tasked with creating worker safety regulations. States can adopt and run their own OSHA plans, and about half of the states do so. State plans must be at least as protective as the federal regulations, but they can go beyond the federal regulations. Most just adopt federal regulations as is, but some do go well beyond. States with regulations significantly beyond federal OSHA include California, Washington, and Oregon. These include things like having an injury and illness prevention plan, or a heat illness plan, or even a wildfire smoke plan. A few states with additional requirements, but to a lesser extent, include Nevada, Minnesota, Michigan, Kentucky, and Virginia. And there are others, of course. One other difference is that state plan rules apply to state and local government employees, while federal OSHA does not. However, federal OSHA does cover federal employees, even in state plan states. And of course, in states covered by federal OSHA, the local government employees usually have other rules to follow. Brandon, I'll turn it over to you now.
Hey everybody. So when OSHA shows up to inspect a workplace, and we'll get to that shortly, they, they almost always find violations, and every year OSHA publishes the top 10 violations, and they don't need to change much from year to year. It seems that employers continue to struggle with the same challenges, but a lot of these citations go to very small employers, usually with fewer than 20 employees. So the first column here shows the most common general industry citations from OSHA's list. You see HAZCOM at the top, or hazard communication, and those mostly for things like training, written plans. But again, more than half of them went to businesses with 20 or fewer employees. So larger employees usually have challenges like maintaining chemical inventory or maintaining STS sheets. Since forklifts are used in so many workplaces, it's not surprising to see powered industrial vehicles on this list. So training citations are common here also, either because OSHA inspector asked questions that the forklift operator couldn't answer, or the inspector saw the operator doing something wrong or unsafe, like not wearing a seat belt, not sounding the horn when coming around a corner, things like that. Other common problems is operating with a mechanical issue, like a missing light or non-functioning horn. So rounding out the top general industry violations, the lockout standard gets cited for training also. Maybe the workers were trained, but it didn't cover everything, or they forgot some of it. For respirators, the most common citation is failing to keep them clean. They might get tossed on a table, or they don't get stored properly. And of course, machine guarding violations often involve a missing or damaged guard. Some other frequently cited standards include walking, working surfaces, and fall protection. Common problems include housekeeping, since we all know that saying cleanliness is the next to impossible, and missing fall protection is a common general industry violation also. Blocked exit routes are also a recurring problem, most frequently in retail and warehousing, but that can, happen anywhere. Since a blocked exit could cost lives during an emergency, OSHA considers this a serious violation with higher penalties. Electrical violations are often simple things like missing an outlet cover or misusing power strips, which can cause a fire hazard. The OSHA uses the general duty clause for things like heat stress and ergonomics. So, since we're talking about the violations that OSHA finds, and we're going to talk about OSHA inspections, we want to ask if you've ever done or gone through an OSHA inspection. So, please answer the poll on your screen. Your options include yes, you had an inspection, or yes, you've had that happen more than once. Or maybe some of you never had one, or at least not yet. We'll give you a moment to answer and then we'll show the results. Your individual answers won't show, but this should give you an idea of how many of your peers have been through the inspection process. We're guessing that quite a few of you operate on state plans, so you might have gone through an inspection by a state agency. The top violations we covered are based on federal inspections, but state agencies seem to find similar problems. Now, So most people are saying no, not yet, which is kind of surprising. Um, I know right when I got in the safety field, within 3 months, I had my first inspection. So it's um, pretty surprising. So, Rachel?
Yep, we can take over here. So, but that was interesting. I saw it looked like 57% had said they had not been through an inspection, and then the other two was kind of mixed there between those who had or were
Yeah.
not sure. So that was interesting. I think the
Yeah.
last time we had done this, like most people had been through one, so I was a little surprised at that, like you
Yeah.
said. So, all right. So although some of, let me move my advance my slide here. Okay, so even though some of you went through an OSHA inspection, and of course, everyone listening could get an inspection at some point. So how does OSHA choose which employers to inspect? Well, inspections can be programmed or they can be unprogrammed. Programmed inspections are planned, but OSHA doesn't tell the employer they're coming. They randomly select a business, but those selections are influenced by things like national emphasis programs or NEPs, as well as high hazard industries. OSHA uses NEPs to target hazards like heat or lead exposure, or they use them to target industries like warehousing. You can find the NEPs online, and they describe exactly what the OSHA inspectors will be looking for if they show up. So that's really a good resource to look through that. OSHA also targets employers with high injury rates, like 2 or more times the national average for that industry. The site we've listed also has a tab for the regional and local emphasis programs, and most regions target things like forklifts, for example. There are about 100 of these regional and local programs, and they can help you evaluate your risk of OSHA knocking on your door, especially if your operations fall under more than one program. Unprogrammed inspections might be done in response to employee complaints, or an employer had to report a fatality or hospitalization, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Or especially for construction, OSHA might stop to do an inspection if a hazard is in plain view, like workers on a roof without fall protection. Keep in mind that not every employee complaint will cause an inspection. If someone calls OSHA to leave a message, OSHA will usually just contact the employer and ask for their side of the story. However, if the complaint is in writing and alleges an imminent danger situation, or if the company has a history of citations, or if the complaint relates to an emphasis program, then OSHA might show up for an inspection. The agency has a page on how they handle complaints that could help you figure out your risk of OSHA showing up if one of your employees contacts OSHA. Brandon, back to you.
All right. So if OSHA shows up for an inspection, first steps include showing the officer's credentials, explaining why they arrived, and starting an open conference. But in reality, the inspector might park nearby and observe the workplace, especially, a construction site that they crossed or things like that, before they announce themselves. They might take photos of violations before knocking on your door. Also, if the outside areas are a mess, more than likely they're going to find a mess inside. So they might be a bit more, shall we say, observant during the inspection. If your safety person is not available, OSHA will wait for up to 1 hour. After that, they'll start the inspection with whomever is available. If it's the, plant manager, CEO, someone like that. This comes back to the planning that we mentioned earlier. The opening conference explains what OSHA came to inspect. The inspection might be focused on a specific type of machine, or it might be the location of a serious accident, or it might be the entire facility. The inspector will usually ask to review records such as lockout tagout programs and injury records. Then they'll walk around the facility and look for violations. Along the way, they may interview employees or they might schedule interviews for later. This whole process can take a couple hours or it can, take several weeks. Just depends on what they find, things like that. So once all that's done, you'll have a closing conference with a list of possible citations. That doesn't mean everything OSHA notice will get cited. The inspector will meet with the OSHA area director to determine which citations to finalize. Eventually, you'll get an official notice of citations and proposed penalties. You can request an informal conference to talk through some issues. And that's always a good idea. If you disagree with one or more of their citations, you can file a notice of intent to contest, which starts with the appeal process. But you must do that within 15 days of getting the notice. And of course, you could just pay the fines, but remember that even if the dollar amount is small, paying the fine means admitted to the violation. If OSHA finds the same problem during a future inspection, even at a different facility, they could issue a repeat violation, and fines are going to be much higher. There's a lot more, of course, and we could go a whole hour on OSHA inspections, but that's an overview. So, then J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite is sponsoring today's event. So we'd like to offer our attendees access to our compliance resources and tools at no cost to help identify and simplify your safety efforts. The J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite offers pre-built inspection checklists covering a range of topics, over 120 plus pre-written safety plans and templates, hundreds of award-winning training programs, incident tracking, and much more. If you'd like to try this compliance resources and tools at no cost, let us know by using the poll to select your interests. Along with your complimentary access, we'll email you our popular OSHA 101. And let's answer a few questions that have come in.
That we could either take a question or two, or Brandon, if you want to talk a little bit about your OSHA inspection that you went through, you could do that as well, because that might be a good timing to do that.
All right, so like I said, my first OSHA inspection I was 3 months into being a safety manager, and OSHA comes in, and right off the bat, the OSHA inspector did not present credentials, and just started walking around the facility. And they were there we thought probably about 30 minutes before the plant manager found them and they introduced themselves. But eventually, they found some violations, but they were eventually thrown out because we didn't, they didn't present their credentials the right way. We didn't have an opening conference before the walk around and things like that. So, when you do have an inspection, make sure those two things are happening before you start the inspections and things like that. So it was a big learning experience. A lot of companies I've seen, they don't really follow the rules until they do have an OSHA inspection and they're not forced to. So it was eye-opening, and it was a good experience. So
I'll bet, especially since you're new on the job too. I think that would be a little bit shocking too.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
but that's good
yeah,
to
it was
know.
learning
Yes.
by fire. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So definitely the credentials and the opening conference are two of the things that should come first. So that's good to know. So next up, we want to talk about injury record keeping under Part 1904. Now, many of you probably need to keep an OSHA 300 log, which means you also need to post a 300A summary every year. And some of you might have to electronically file your injury data through the Injury Tracking Application, or ITA. We could spend several hours on OSHA record keeping, but for today, we're covering some basics that seem to cause a lot of confusion. So first, are you even required to keep a 300 log? OSHA provides two partial exceptions. One is for employers with 10 or fewer employees. However, that counts all employees at all locations. For example, if you have 3 locations with 4 employees each, you have 12 employees and would not qualify for the size exemption. Each location might have to keep a 300 log even though only a few employees work there. The second exception is based on industry codes. OSHA partially exempts some very low-risk industries like shoe stores, bookstores, and insurance agencies. These are called partial exemptions because even though these employers don't need to maintain an OSHA 300 log, they still have to report any work-related fatality, inpatient hospitalization, amputation, or loss of an eye. All employers, even those partially exempted by size or by industry, must contact OSHA if they have a serious injury or fatality. Failing to make these reports is a common violation. One point of confusion, however, is that just going to hospital emergency room is not an inpatient hospitalization. OSHA defines that as being formally admitted for care or treatment. So if someone goes to the ER for a couple of stitches, they usually are not formally admitted and you don't have to call OSHA. Some state reporting rules differ, so do be aware of your requirements if you're in a state plan state. So, for example, California has shorter reporting times, and Hawaii requires reporting certain property damage even if nobody was injured. Next up, if your company has multiple locations and maintains the 300 logs, you need a separate log for each establishment. OSHA defines an establishment as a single physical location. That applies even if a location has fewer than 10 employees. Remember, the partial exemption is for size is based on the number of employees in the entire company, not just the number at each location. Finally, if you must electronically file injury data with the Injury Tracking Application, or ITA, that requirement does depend on the number of employees at the location. It also depends on your North American Industry Classification System code, or NAICS code. So if you operate multiple locations, you might have some that must report and others that do not, based on employee counts or industry code. Now, we could spend a whole hour or more just on this reporting, but as a high-level overview, any establishment with fewer than 20 employees does not have to report. But if you have locations with 20 or more employees, you want to check your NAICS code against the appendix in 1904 subpart E. By the way, you choose your own NAICS code. OSHA does not assign these to you. So if you have 20 or more employees and your NAICS code is in Appendix A, you must file the 300A by March 2nd every year. If you have 100 or more employees and you're listed in Appendix B, you must file the 300A along with some additional information. Finally, every location with 250 or more employees that's required to maintain an OSHA 300 log must file the 300A, unless they're partially exempted from keeping a 300 log like we covered earlier. Brandon?
All right, so now let's turn our attention to training requirements. So there's no one size fits all regulation when it comes to training or a specific list of topics you must train on. The first place to look for training requirements is in the federal OSHA standards. You can see that on the slide, and there are different places to look depending on your industry. OSHA uses the term general industry, which is 29 CFR 1910, to refer to all industries that are not agricultural, construction, or maritime. So general industry is a big umbrella. It can be office workers, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, warehouses, and many more. Think about what hazards your employees are exposed to. That's where training comes in. Employees must be aware of the hazards they're exposed to and understand how to protect themselves. Over the next few slides, we'll give you the general industry regulations with training requirements. You may fall under, a number of these regulations, but don't get overwhelmed. Not all of them apply. All right, so there are over 70 general industry regulations with training requirements. Remember that training depends on whether that topic applies to your work that your employees are doing. As an example, there are training requirements for commercial diving, but that probably won't apply to most y'all. Most regulations have paragraphs that explains who it applies to, as well as definitions, sections. Bloodborne pathogens is one example. You might assume it's only healthcare employees, but it depends on whether an employee has occupational exposure. That can include designated first aid responders in a warehouse or a factory. So here are some highlights: access to employees' exposures and medical records, because if you have those records, then you must annually inform, your employees of the existence, location, and availability of those exposure records and medical records. Who's responsible for maintaining and providing access to these records, and the employee's rights to access them. This regulation defines what is and is not considered an employee exposure record or an employee medical record, so you can determine whether it applies to you or not. Adding to the list, we can see some topics that are probably more familiar, such as, eye and face protection, hazard communication or HAZCOM, injury or illness record keeping, lockout, tagout, and occupational noise exposure. But let's go back to injury and illness record keeping. We highlighted this one. You might keep records of employee injuries and illnesses, but what you may not know is that regulation requires you to inform employees about certain things. So, how they are to report a work-related injury or illness to you, your procedure for reporting work-related injuries or illnesses. Employees have the right to report work-related injuries or illnesses, and that you are prohibited from discharging or firing and in any way discriminating against employees for reporting work-related injuries or illnesses. And then back to Rachel.
All right, so here again, we can see some familiar topics. You have personal protective equipment or PPE, powered industrial trucks, and walking working surfaces. Excuse me. A frequent question we often get asked on fire extinguisher training is whether employees must have hands-on training. Well, that depends how you expect employees to respond to a fire. If some employees are designated to use fire extinguishers, then they must receive annual hands-on training. But if you just expect other employees to evacuate, they don't need this training. We've also highlighted telecommunications on this slide. This is because we're often asked whether there's an annual training requirement for telecommunications. The regulations don't have an annual training requirement, but OSHA would expect you to provide refresher training if an employee was not using safe work practices or otherwise appears to need additional training. I also want to point out, in case you missed it, that there's an asterisk by some of the listed regulations. And those are the rules that require annual refresher training. And we will talk more about refresher training in a minute. On this slide, we've listed all the toxic and hazardous substances that have a training element. And these are found in subpart Z of part 1910. So if you use any of these substances, you have some training requirements. And you can see that nearly all of them require annual refresher training. By the way, many of the sections here include listed exposure limits for employees. If you are monitoring for employee exposures like airborne contaminants, that monitoring result will be an employee exposure record that we talked about earlier. I bring this up because of a common point of confusion we've seen. If you're using one of these substances, but your monitoring shows exposure below the action level listed in the regulation, that still counts as an employee exposure record. OSHA does not limit that term to exposures at hazardous levels. That's important because OSHA requires you to save those exposure records for 30 years. A lot of OSHA regulations require training, as you saw on the previous slides, but not all of them require annual refresher training. The most common rules with refresher training requirements are listed here. There are quite a few in subpart Z, but those are mostly for specific chemicals like lead or formaldehyde. Even if a standard requires training, like forklifts, it doesn't necessarily require annual refresher. A forklift operator must be evaluated every 3 years, but that's not the same as training. In a lot of cases, you probably do give regular training, like annual fire evacuation drills under your emergency action plan. Also, a lot of standards don't even use the word training, but they still have requirements like keeping exit routes clear. Since blocking exits is a common violation, maybe training on that is a good idea. And again, you must tell employees how to report injuries. And I'm sure a lot of you struggle with getting employees to report injuries. Brandon?
All right. So to check if refresher training might be needed, ask employees about key topics they should have learned. You don't have to ask everybody. And if you don't need a long list of questions. Just spot check a few workers with a couple key topics, like show me how do you get an SDS sheet, things like that. If they can't answer, they probably need refresher training. In fact, this is one way that OSHA finds training violations during inspections. Also, you hopefully audit the workplace and keep track of problems you notice during the walkarounds. If you observe hazards or unsafe behaviors that were covered in training, then some employees probably need refresher training. Even if refresher training is not required, or you just delivered the training, 3 months ago, you might want to retrain. Violations indicate that training wasn't effective or that employees don't remember it. It also is if OSHA showed up, they would, find Would your employees be able to answer questions from the OSHA inspector and things like that? So, when it comes to trainer requirements, the best place to look is in the individual regulations. That said, most regulations don't mention any trainer requirements. An example of one that does is 1910.178 in the powered industrial trucks. There, OSHA says the trainer must have the knowledge, training, and experience necessary to conduct training. So OSHA left this performance oriented basically to the employer. They're going to decide if someone is qualified to be a forklift trainer. OSHA believes that the trainer qualifications could be obtained in a variety of ways, like years of operating a PIT and knowledge of safe practice and OSHA regulations. And then going to a train the trainer or similar course and some combination of experience and training. Even if regulation doesn't have trainer requirements, OSHA would expect that the trainer is familiar with the regulations and how it's being applied to your workplace. Before you jump into training, determine what you're trying to accomplish. What do you want the learners to understand? What should they take back to their jobs? Even for refresher training, plan ahead and choose objectives you'd like to accomplish. When delivering training, remember to show the benefits and especially how the content applies to the trainees and their job. They need to know why it matters to them. Are they using a new type of PPE, working with new equipment or a new chemical? Are they being reminded of how to find the SDS sheets or safety data sheets? OSHA doesn't require that you give them a quiz or test after training, but it's a great way to see if employees are understanding, the content that you're giving them. We've heard that some employers give the quiz about 2 weeks after the training to see if anybody remembered the material. Also, consider following, up training by observing employees at work to see if they're using what they've learned. And then finally, it's best practice to maintain training records if regulations don't require it. Training records help show a good faith, to OSHA if they were to inspect, and that you have conducted the training that you're saying is happening. And they help keep, your training program organized.
All right, so don't forget about temporary employees. OSHA says that both the host employer and the staffing agency are responsible for ensuring that temporary employees are properly trained. However, the employers may jointly review the task assignments and the job hazards to divide up the training responsibilities. Typically, the staffing agency provides generic training and the host employer provides site-specific training. OSHA has a number of Temporary Worker Initiative or TWI bulletins, which are listed on the slide. The bulletins address what both the staffing agency and the host employer can do to provide safety training to temporary workers. So you may wish to take a look at these if you have temporary workers. Now, these bulletins don't create any additional requirements, but they do provide guidance on dividing up those training responsibilities. So now I'd like to take a quick poll on how often you deliver training. So my question is, do you deliver regular refresher training, maybe annually or every 2 years, even if OSHA does not require refresher training? So we have a few choices for you here of yes, we do this for many topics. Yes, but only for a few topics. Yes, but only if we have to, like maybe you've identified a problem or maybe an incident investigation found a lack of training. Or no, you only deliver refresher training if OSHA requires it. So please take a moment to answer and we'll show the results. I choose this question because I spoke to the safety manager at a chemical manufacturing plant and asked if they deliver any refresher training on hazard communication. That is a common violation, as we noted, but the regulation actually doesn't require refresher training. So this safety pro said that they don't do HazCom refresher, and that kind of surprised me because it seems like something people would do annually. But he explained that the employees apply what they learn so frequently that they remember it. And since things like time and resources are always limited, they just don't feel the need for a refresher. So I'm really curious to see how many of you deliver refresher training, even if it's not an OSHA requirement. So we'll give you a little time to answer here, and then we'll see what people have said. All right, so it looks like 44% of you say yes, you deliver it on many topics, 37% on a few topics, 11% only as needed, and 8% only if required. All right, that's great. Thanks for participating. So, changing topics, let's talk about written plans. One of the first things an OSHA officer will look at during an inspection is your written safety plans. Just by looking over your hazard communication program or respiratory protection program, OSHA can see how well you're protecting your workers. So, here you see OSHA's required written plans, at least those outside of Subpart Z. It's actually a pretty short list. Not a lot of regulations require a written plan, and it's likely that not all of these apply to you. But pretty much everyone should have an emergency action plan and fire prevention plan. Some missing items might surprise you. For example, if your employees have noise exposure, you might need a hearing conservation program. OSHA doesn't require this to be in writing, but if you have one, you probably do document that. So this is not a list of everything you need, it's just a list of what's required by OSHA. Other plans you might need could cover anything from accident investigations to workplace violence. You might also want plans on things like heat stress prevention, ergonomics, or combustible dust. Brandon?
All right, so as we mentioned earlier, each regulation does have a scope and applicability section. If you find that the regulation does apply to you, you'll want to see if there's a written plan requirement and read it carefully. If the regulation says that you must have a written plan, then you'll need to write one. If you're in a state plan like California, Minnesota, or Washington, South Carolina, for example, your state may have more stringent requirements than the federal OSHA requirements. And it may require additional plans. So we encourage you to check your state regulations. Also note that workers' compensation agency may call for other written plans or provide discounts when certain plans are implemented. You may wonder what to include in your plan. First, if there is a regulation, read it carefully. Many times, that'll give you a list of required plan elements. If so, by all means, follow the list. For example, the respiratory protection standard lists 9 elements that must be included in the written program. But even when plan elements are listed, sometimes the legal jargon can slow you down. If that happens, it may help to see if the teams are defined in the regulations or see if a section of the regulation goes into more detail. And of course, there are compliance directive or letters of interpretation that go more into depth. You may use a template when starting to write your plan, but you must tailor the plan to your site and your operations. If your plan has not been tailored to your site, it will likely not be effective. Now, you can use a template to get started. Templates give you something to work with, and rather than starting with a blank sheet of paper, but you still need to fill in the details. So having gone through all that, conducting self-inspections or self-audits is a great way to find problems before an OSHA inspector shows up. If you find recurring problems like blocked exits or blocked electrical panels, you'll need to address that. You might even catch employees doing something unsafe, and that could be a training issue or something else. If you ask your employees some questions about their training, that might need help clarifying the problem, or it might identify a training shortfall. You don't have to inspect the entire facility at one time. You might choose specific areas where you might focus on a particular topic, such as following lockout tagout procedures. We know that self audits can be time consuming, and you might not have all the expertise required for every topic. With hundreds of pages of OSHA regulations, it really is hard to be an expert in everything. So bringing in outside experts can help. They also notice things that you've started to overlook as part of the background. And if you get a report showing a list of problems from a consultant, that can help you convince upper management that you do have some safety issues to address. So it's always helpful. All right, we're wrapping up by talking about self audits because those help identify problems in many other areas we covered. You might find some of those common OSHA violations we mentioned. At minimum, those common problems should be in your mind when you're walking around. Observing your employees while they perform typical duties and ask them some questions about things they should have learned during training can also help identify any shortfalls. As we noted, this is similar to how OSHA inspections would proceed, so you're really likely doing a mock inspection. As you run your compliance checks, you should choose to focus on specific topics such as lockout, tagout, as we mentioned earlier. In that case, you should be carrying around written procedures. We all know that written plans won't do any good on the shelf. They might need to be implemented. So, and Rachel?
All right, so now it is time for your questions. If you haven't sent yours in, now is the time to do so. Brandon and I would also like to thank our event sponsor, JJ Keller Safety Management Suite. With your complimentary access, you'll access our most popular safety management tools, including written safety plan templates, customizable training programs, audit and inspection checklists, word for word federal regulations, state regulatory comparisons, and much more. If you missed the opportunity for complimentary access to Safety Management Suite and you aren't already using it, let us know your interest and how we can help with the poll on your screen. Along with your complimentary access, we'll email you our popular white paper, OSHA 101, What Every Business Should Know. So let's move on now to questions that have come in.
Excellent. Great job, Rachel and Brandon. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise. Before we do start the Q&A, just want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar. Your input is very important as it, excuse me, your input is very important as it helps us to improve our future webcasts. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button to submit. If we don't get to your question today, all unanswered questions will be forwarded along to our speakers. With that, first question says, if I'm understanding correctly, OSHA is allowed to do a spot or unannounced visit if they see a visual concern from outside the facility or if they receive a complaint. Is this correct?
I'll take that one. Absolutely. You know, the OSHA inspection I was a part of, they showed up unannounced, but usually it's some type of referral, a programmed inspection, maybe an employee filed a complaint. That can be follow-up inspections or, an imminent danger sort of situation. So it's actually rare that OSHA will tell you they're coming. So, um, so short answer is yes. So,
All right, thank you. Next question asks, do you offer OSHA 30?
Yes, we do offer that. You can get to that through Safety Management Suite. It is through a third-party vendor that we contract with, but they do offer that. That is how I got my OSHA 30 not that long ago.
All right. If we have multiple establishments, which 300 logs should we record incidents on?
I can take that one. If an employee is visiting one of your establishments and gets injured, you would record that on the OSHA, the 300 log for that location, so even if they normally work somewhere else. But if someone is injured while they're traveling between your locations, for example, then you record the case on the log where they normally work. So record it at the establishment where it happened.
Does heat stress need to be reported on OSHA logs?
I'll take that one. Um, First, you need to establish if the heat stress is work related and if it does meet the requirements for a recordable. For heat stress, to be recordable, it had to be, cause of fatality, had to be days away from work, restricted work or transfer, medical treatment beyond first aid, or loss of consciousness. So, if you do, establish that it is work related, then, it would be, um, an OSHA reportable. A couple examples, if an employee faints during from heat and misses work, it would be, need to be on your OSHA 300 log. If an employee was hospitalized, it'd also be recordable, things like that.
All right. Again, as we press on, we've got some time. If you want to ask a question of Rachel or of Brandon, just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Now, the next question, what training does OSHA require for new hires?
Well, I can take that one. There's no training that specifically applies to new hires. Essentially, OSHA's training requirements depend on the hazards that employees are exposed to. Now, new hires, of course, would have to know how to report an injury or illness to you and what to do in an emergency like a fire or tornado, something like that. But other safety training is really going to depend on the hazards that they're exposed to. So as an example, if they're working with chemicals, they would need hazard communication training. And if they're working with forklifts, they need training under the powered industrial truck standard. So you can reference those training slides that we provided, and they'll show kind of help you determine what training you might need under general industry.
All right. Next question says it's a follow-up to the reporting session, and it asks if you have an employee who is visiting a building that is owned by someone else, who is responsible for reporting?
I could say that one. So if you have an employee that's visiting another factory that's not owned by that same company, I'm guessing that's what they're referring to, then, it would have to be reported on the company that the employee works for, their OSHA log, because he does work for them and he's going there on a work-related visit. So
All right. Next question's for Rachel. It asks, when discussing yearly refresher training, can that be provided via computer-based training?
Yes, you can certainly use some computer-based training. I would say also if it's processes though that are specific to your company, as you're saying, refresher training as far as HAZCOM, where your SDSs are, where your written program is, things like that, you'll have to also cover that site-specific information, but certainly you can also use computer-based training as part of that.
All right, thank you. Another one now for Rachel. It asks, is hearing protection recommended or required if noise level in the workplace is between the OSHA action level and the OSHA PEL?
That's, if it would also depend not only on the action level or the OSHA PEL, it would also depend on the time weighted average. So if it's also equals the 8 hour over the 8 hour time span, um, either one of those, you'd have to have hearing protection if it's also in that time range, 8 hours or more over that 85 decibels or more.
All right. Next question goes to Brandon. How often are OSHA logs audited and is it random?
there's not really you do have to send them in once a year to the online reporting. And OSHA does use that data to target inspections and things like that. But you as a company want to do it regularly so they're staying up to date in case you do have an inspection. That is one of the first things they will look at is your OSHA logs to see, what areas they want to look at and things like that. And just you want to do it, maybe once a month or if you have any updates to some of the injuries and things like that. So it's not really you know, a frequency thing. It's, whatever you think's the best way to update them and in case you do have an inspection.
Does OSHA require companies to have a safety committee?
I can take that one. Federal OSHA does not require that you have a safety committee, but several states that run their own occupational safety and health programs do have requirements for safety committees, and I believe that sometimes your workers' comp in your state may also require that. So definitely if you're in a state plan state, you'll want to check those requirements. So often those state requirements target specific industries or employers with a certain number of employees. So definitely take a look at that if you are in a state plan state.
Again, still have some time, so we got a question or so left. But again, if you have any questions today for Rachel or Brandon, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Next one now goes to Brandon. It says, some incidents may take longer than 7 days to investigate to determine OSHA recordability. If it's not an obvious event, is it better to get it on the log and redline later or wait until there's a definite conclusion?
To me, it's better to get it on there and change it later if you have to. Then you have an inspection and they see that you didn't record this one that wasn't recordable. So I would go ahead and record it. And if you figure out it was non-work related or something like that, then you can always go back and take it off. So just be better safe than sorry.
All right, thank you. Now this one for Rachel. What's the start of classes to teach OSHA and where do I go for that area?
If I'm assuming you're talking about the OSHA outreach training, which is the OSHA 10 and 30 hour, in that case, OSHA has a lot of resources on their website. If you go to osha.gov and look under training, it's going to be under OSHA outreach training, and that kind of outlines, all the places where you can go to, what classes you have to take to become an instructor, and where those classes are offered for you to take that. So I would start there. That has a good resource. Or even in your state, if you are at a state plan state, a lot of times on their website, they will also have classes you can take towards becoming an OSHA 10 or 30-hour instructor. So take a look at either osha.gov under OSHA outreach training, or the state plan state. If you're in one of those, take a look at your state OSHA site.
Right. For Brandon, this one asks, is it hearsay or factual that larger companies are more susceptible to an OSHA inspection?
Larger companies are generally more likely to be inspected. Those size alone really isn't the only factor. You know, for the first factor, you more employees equal more risk, and that's just the simple conclusion about it. The more employees you have, the more things, more safety violations you may have, more injuries you will have over time. And then, industry targeting, emphasis program, those OSHA logs that you send in at the beginning of the year, they use those to target certain injuries. If they find the, manufacturing sector, automobile sectors having, more injuries per year than all the other ones, then they're more likely to target those industries for inspection. And then, a lot of it, depends on complaint volume or public visibility and things like that. So, um, yes and no. So it's not that they, just think we're going to inspect all the big companies in the area. It's more targeted than that. So.
Again, another call for questions. Well, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, but just as we await some possible more questions, anything left unsaid, Rachel or Brandon, or anything you'd like to talk about further?
I would say with the size of the company, I just wanted to bring something up that I thought was interesting, that I had recently learned. That one of my coworkers had said that for HAZCOM violations, it's usually small employers with 20 or fewer employees that get dinged for HAZCOM violations, which I thought was interesting. I thought in that case it was going to be big companies with lots of chemicals, but not necessarily. It's that in this case, when I looked that up, it is for HAZCOM anyway, 20 or fewer employees. So that kind of surprised me. And a lot of that was in construction, but there was also, I think the second highest one was the manufacturing industries as well. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting point.
No, absolutely. Brandon, anything further from you?
Just to add on to that, that makes sense to me. Larger companies usually try to, you know, be more compliant. They usually do have a, environmental or safety professional on site that helps usher in those programs. And, if you're a company with 10 to 20 employees, more than likely, you're not going to know those sort of things because you don't have a safety individual that's working there and things like that. So it's usually the big companies that have the safety professionals. So, and that, they know what to look for. So I can see that happening.
Looks like a couple more questions have come in. One was asking if you might go into the difference between performance-based and prescriptive standards. But actually, before that one, is there a household use exemption for SDS chemical use in industry?
Uh, oh, were you going to take the one, Brandon? Otherwise, I can jump on that one.
You can take it.
That one, there is a consumer use exemption in 1910-1200 in paragraph B6. That's going to depend on how the consumer product is used. So if it's something that's used to clean, if you're using it for custodial purposes, that's something that's not going to meet that exemption because you're using it more more frequently and in greater quantities than a normal household consumer would use that. But if it's something that's used once in a while, here and there for cleaning, then that would probably meet that exemption. So it's possible you would have some consumer products that would meet the exemption at B6 and some that would not. So that really is going to depend on the frequency and use of the duration of their use.
Thank you. This one goes to Brandon. Are fire drills ever required in the workplace or just during the employment phase?
So fire drills are required once a year. You can use a actual fire drill to the findings that you find from it, you can use as that, one per year. But yes, fire drills are required, and training over, the emergency action plan, things like that. So,
A couple of these are in regard to, I know you've spoken on them and run the polls on them about just about the resources that you mentioned. One says that they're new to their position and a lot of this is brand new for them and they'd like to get access to any tools that you provide. Is there an introduction course or other courses that you would recommend to be helpful?
I would say maybe our workplace safety basics courses that kind of gives a broad overview of workplace hazards. I think there's 4 in that training series. So that might be a good place to start just to get an idea of a broad overview of possible workplace hazards.
Does OSHA monitor secondary containers and labeling?
They do. They will take a look at that if you have hazardous chemicals, and they will definitely make sure that everything is labeled and that it is labeled with the chemical name and the hazards. There are a couple different ways to do that. You can follow, if you have secondary containers, you can either follow the requirements at F1 for the shipped containers, or F6 talks about workplace containers, and there's a couple different options for that, but they will definitely look to make sure that you've at least labeled it with the chemical name and the hazards.
Okay, well, no, again, I know you both have been very thorough today and you've kind of said your last remarks, but before we get to closing today, anything else you want to add or remind people of?
Well, I was going to say this, the question about the performance-based and prescriptive standards. I think the performance-based is a lot of, OSHA is, I guess, like HAZCOM or the forklift standard. I think those are kind of telling you what you have to do, but it's going to depend more on your workplace. So it's what you have to do, but it'll depend on the hazards in your workplace and how you're not, I don't know, I guess it's more workplace dependent. So even though it is a regulation, you kind of have some leeway there with how you comply with it. I guess that's the best way to say between performance and prescriptive standards. That there's some leeway in how you go about complying with it.
yeah,
Okay.
I know prescriptive is good whenever you have like multiple sites and there's like one clear practice that you have to follow and very rigid, it's easier enforcement. And then, performance based is, if you have a complex sort of work environment and, you want to have flexibility and be more efficient in certain things. So, both of them have good and bad, good in certain ways and, it doesn't apply to the others.
Okay. Well, as we get ready to conclude, once again, just want to ask you and hope you take the time to fill out that forthcoming evaluation survey and to give us your feedback. With that, we'll end today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. We'd like to thank Rachel Krubsack, Brandon Black, everyone at JJ Keller, and all of you who listened in. Thanks and have a great day.